All right, hi guys. We're going to do things a little differently today. I'm going to have you listen to me over the computer. That way, if you need to pause at any time and do another round in your lab, you can. And then you can always come back and restart the video wherever you left off. Make sure you're taking out your notebooks and you have it open to page 23. We're going to do aerobic versus anaerobic respiration today. We talked about cellular respiration last week, and we're going a little more into depth looking at the two different ways respiration can occur. So on page 23, make sure to start with the title, Aerobic versus Anaerobic. I also want you to write today's objective because we did not do that with the warm-up today. So objective 2E is to conduct a lab to investigate anaerobic respiration. The good news is you've already started this. You have your lab going right now as I speak. And you're going to take these notes down just to understand a little bit more about what is occurring with the yeast in the form of anaerobic respiration. To do so, we got to compare both aerobic and anaerobic. Keep in mind, guys, if I'm going too fast and right now you're still writing your objective down, you may pause the video and press play when you're ready so you can go at your own pace today. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our first slide, and then you can just pause, like I said, if you need to at any point. Let's start with aerobic respiration and what that means. If you start with aerobic, aero, the beginning of that word actually means air. So aerobic respiration specifically refers to with oxygen. The presence of oxygen has to be there in order for this to occur. And respiration, as we discussed last week, is the breathing in and out. So pretty much aerobic respiration is cellular respiration that can occur when oxygen is present. This is typically what we mean when we talk about cellular respiration because we usually assume oxygen is available, but we'll discuss when it's not as easily available when we get to anaerobic. So just remember, aerobic with oxygen. Now this occurs like we've talked about before, cellular respiration, specifically aerobic respiration, happens in the mitochondria, the organelle of the cell that is very important for many reasons, including it's the location of aerobic respiration. Now let's look at or remind ourselves of the reactants and products. We know this from last week, but it's good to review. Aerobic respiration needs both oxygen, like we discussed, aerobic needs oxygen, and glucose. Remember, glucose is C6H12O6. It's sugar. That's very important for aerobic respiration. Now, a cell will break down that sugar and use the oxygen to create different products. The most important product is ATP, and it's a lot of it. In aerobic respiration, you actually need 38 molecules of ATP. That's very important. 38 is quite a lot of that gasoline, that power for the cell. So most of the time, cells have adapted to use aerobic respiration because it creates the most energy of these two processes. Keep in mind, not only does it make it makes ATP, it also makes CO2 and water as byproducts. But the main reason for aerobic respiration is all that ATP. And don't forget that CO2 is what leaves the cells and we will later breathe out as humans, and most animals do that as well. Now we have the other process I mentioned earlier, which is part of what we're seeing in the lab today, and that's anaerobic. Anaerobic, the AN in the front means opposite or without. So when we talk about anaerobic, we mean without or no oxygen present. You might be wondering, why would this ever occur? There'd be no oxygen. Well, this happens in a couple different ways. Sometimes organisms live in an area with very little to no oxygen, so they need to do a different type of respiration in order to still get that cellular energy, that ATP. Also, anaerobic respiration can happen in our own human cells. Specifically, you see this in muscle cells. When you're exercising a lot and can't quite get all the needed oxygen to those cells, they will rely instead, they'll switch over to anaerobic respiration in order to still get that ATP that your cells need, but they'll do it without the oxygen available. Now, there is a couple reasons we don't tend to do this, and that comes in with our products, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Now, anaerobic does happen slightly different location. It does not happen in the mitochondria. Instead, it happens outside the mitochondria in what is called the cytoplasm. And we will talk more about the cytoplasm when we get into parts of cells, but just for now know that a slight difference with anaerobic respiration is that it occurs outside of the mitochondria. The big difference between anaerobic and aerobic, of course, comes down to its reactants and products. Reactants, only thing that is needed for anaerobic is glucose. Still needs sugar, still needs something to break down to make that ATP. But remember, anaerobic means no oxygen, so our only reactant is glucose. Other differences is the products. It produces much less ATP, specifically only 2 molecules versus that 38 that we saw in aerobic respiration. So most of the time, our bodies don't want to use anaerobic because it doesn't make as much energy for our cells, but it can use it if needed. Now, of course, it still produces CO2, just like aerobic, so that they both produce that gas as a byproduct. Another difference, though, is that it makes lactic acid or ethanol, depending on the organism, and the creation of that ethanol is what we call fermentation, which is partially what we're seeing today. Not partially, it is what we're seeing today with the yeast. You should be seeing it go through anaerobic where you're creating, in the case of the yeast, it's creating ethanol, but in our cells, in human cells, you'll see scientists have measured that those cells with no oxygen will create lactic acid. You'll see more about this in the video, which I'm going to have you watch next. During the video, you have 3 sentence stems on your note sheet. I need to make sure that all your notes, including these 3 sentence stems, are complete to earn your stamp, your second stamp of the day. Keep in mind you need all 3 tasks done and stamped off by me before you are excused from class. So when you're watching the video, you may pause the video if you need to. You may go back and rewind, get to the section you need to if you miss something. But this video does a good job of comparing anaerobic and aerobic, specifically in terms of what happens on our human muscle cells when the muscle cells cannot get enough oxygen. So please go ahead and enjoy this video, and then I'll come back in a few minutes and wrap up our notes today.
Your body requires energy to do all sorts of different things, such as muscle contractions, transmitting nerve impulses, growth, protein synthesis, active transport, maintaining a constant body temperature, and all of this is required in the form of a chemical called adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. This is provided by a process called respiration, and this happens inside of animal cells, as well as plant cells, in little organelles called the mitochondria. Glucose is provided by your food and oxygen is provided through breathing, and a whole series of complex chemical reactions take place, but the result is carbon dioxide and water are produced. In that process, energy is released. The word equation for this is dead simple. You just plug in those things that we've mentioned going into and out of the cell. Glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water. And this process is specifically known as aerobic respiration. Now, sometimes under some circumstances, this oxygen is not available in as ready supply as your cells need it. For example, imagine you're doing a sprint and your breathing rate will increase, so you'll be taking deeper breaths, but you're still not going to get as much oxygen as you necessarily need. If that oxygen is not there, these products are not going to be released. This process of aerobic respiration is not going to progress. The alternative is that in the absence of oxygen, glucose will be converted to lactic acid, and in the process it will release a very small amount of energy. The word equation for this is, again, very simple. Glucose goes to lactic acid, and this process is known as anaerobic respiration. One problem associated with anaerobic respiration is something called oxygen debt. The lactic acid that's being produced is toxic and it must be broken down. This breakdown of lactic acid requires oxygen. And so, after you've done some exercise, you're going to have to repay that oxygen by breathing more deeply. So, you'll take deeper breaths even after you've finished this exercise. Let's look at the two compared side by side. we can obviously see that anaerobic respiration has the advantage that where aerobic respiration needs oxygen, anaerobic respiration can progress in its absence. But the trade-off is there's a very small release of energy by comparison, and while the products of aerobic respiration are easily released, for example carbon dioxide is easily removed via the lungs, oxygen debt is required to break down lactic acid. And let's think about how you could get assessed on this in an exam. What is the word equation for aerobic respiration in plants? Now this is a bit of a sneaky question because you might end up mixing up aerobic respiration and photosynthesis because it's specified plants. But what you need to realize is that aerobic respiration in plants is exactly the same as it is in animals. And so the answer is A. Glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water.
All right, guys, we're going to finish up our notes right now with the last thing I'd like you to do before we glue this in our notebooks. Please go ahead and at the bottom, like we did last week, I want you to do your main takeaway from today's class, or specifically the notes. What do you think the main idea of these notes were? Or what's something you learned today that you did not do before? Complete that on your note sheet and then glue it in on page 23. Keep in mind, I will not stamp your notes unless all of this is complete, including the main takeaway. So with that, go ahead and finish this up. Glue it in on page 23 and then raise your hand and I'll come around and give you a stamp. Now, once you've got that stamp, you can move on to the third task today, which is different choices for practice based on how you think you're doing on cellular respiration and photosynthesis. More information is back on Google Classroom, so check there and then get your level practice from the back table. You should be able to see where the signs are. If not, ask me where to go. All right, enjoy, guys. Move on to task 3 when you're ready. Thank you.